Welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg. And today's episode is brought to you by our featured patron, PT Barpun. Thank you, PT, for being a patron.
Hey, Anna.
Today, we are going to be digging into a controversial topic, Tony. Controversial to say that it's a bad idea. And I'm going to spread the blame around just a little bit and mention that it was not my own idea to cover this, but this was suggested by the Gamork over on YouTube. He wanted us to cover this. I assume it's a he. Might be a mistake. But
I'd say thank you, Gamork, but the Space Shuttle's awesome, so you're a jerk.
Well, I'm going to be a jerk right along with the Gamork and talk about why the Space Shuttle was probably a mistake. Now, for all of you guys who are on Tony's side and you love the Space Shuttle, I get it. I mean, it's an iconic spacecraft. It has that look, right? There's not any other rocket, even today, that has a similar profile. When you're looking at the Space Shuttle, you know what that thing is, whereas everything else is just some big stick with, a payload on the top. The Space Shuttle was something different. It was something cool, and if you are a lover of the Space Shuttle, I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong for loving it. But it has some problems, and we're going to talk about them.
I mean, 2 of them did explode.
Yes, we'll get to that. But before we get there, we're going to start back in February of 1969. Now, for those of you who know your NASA history, you know that this is in the full swing of the Apollo program. They have just orbited the moon with Apollo 8. There is a planned moon landing in sight, and NASA does not want to lose momentum. NASA has bigger plans than just the moon. And they say, listen, we're going to keep going into space. There's so many more secrets to discover. If we can put a man on the moon, why not put somebody on Mars? Why not keep going further? What about the stars? And we need to take that next step. So they start putting together a plan for the next step. Now, the Saturn V, the rocket that had put the moon within reach, was a monster of propulsion. This thing was actually not the best, finesse designed space-going vessel that you could have ever imagined. The Russians got better rocket engineers from the Germans than we did, from what I read. But the Americans made up for it by just throwing massive amounts of horsepower in their rockets, and they managed to get to space anyway.
Yep, just brute force your way to the skies.
But there was going to need to be a little bit more finesse, more variety going forward. And so President Richard Nixon and NASA together formed the Space Task Group to come up with a plan for what would happen next. And NASA Administrator Thomas Paine, not the guy who wrote Common Sense, different era, different Thomas Paine, he had been working on such a plan for several years already. And he called it the Space Transportation System, or the STS. And this plan is about that further progression I was talking about, Tony. Paine believed that NASA could do so much more, and he thought that once we had succeeded in reaching the moon, the public and political appetite for space exploration would grow even larger. And the STS was just what he thought was needed to feed that expected hunger. The STS included multiple space stations in various orbits, so you would have a low Earth orbit space station like we have now with the International Space Station, and then you would have one that would be higher up, further closer to geosynchronous orbit. I don't know if it would be quite that far out, but, sort of a farther ring. You would have a space tug that could also be used as a lunar lander. There would be a nuclear rocket-powered taxi to carry the crew and goods between the different space stations. And there would be a space shuttle to carry crew and goods from the Earth into orbit. And importantly, in this plan, it was assumed that the Saturn V, or something a lot like it, would continue in operation to be used for lifting larger heavy loads into orbit as well. The initial pitch for the space shuttle is, it's this little thing, maybe you can fit a little cargo in there, it's kind of multi-purpose, but it's not going to do everything. It's just going to do some stuff. It's a crew carrier, it's some cargo carrier, but we're going to keep it relatively limited. It's essentially like I mentioned, there was a taxi between the space stations. This would be the taxi between Earth and the space station that they would build. But to get all of this, Thomas Paine would have to convince Richard Nixon to back his program. And Richard Nixon, despite being universally lauded as one of the best presidents, having a completely flawless presidency and not being disliked for really any other reasons, he did have this one problem.
He even had a perfect nose.
Yes. Yeah, and a bunch of other perfection. But the one thing he did that was sort of a defect in Nixon was that he wasn't a big fan of the space program. Now, like I said, I hate to make him the villain here. I know that goes against what everybody's expecting from this story, but it turns out Nixon actually is the big problem. He's the one who sets the tone for space travel after the Apollo program. Nixon liked the prestige of being president of the country that could land a man on the moon, but beyond puffing his chest out about being the president and landing people on the moon and not giving any credit to JFK, who actually started the program, he didn't really see a lot of value in it. So in 1971, after landing multiple people on the moon multiple times, when NASA's budget went to Congress for approval, it came back not bigger, but 10% smaller. Washington was sending NASA a crystal clear message. Flying to the moon was not going to be a regular thing, much less a mission to Mars. Space travel was still useful to people in Washington for things like military spy satellites and maybe GPS type stuff that would be developed as the space program went on. But all that fancy exploration stuff was just gonna have to go. But what happened was that the STS plan didn't go away. It was sort of morphed a little bit by little bit, compromise by compromise, piece by piece. It was slowly stripped away until it was nearly unrecognizable.
So that's why we ended up with a space shuttle that could only go into low Earth orbit?
Exactly. So they got rid of the space tug. The atomic rockets, sadly, were eliminated. The multiple space stations, and even the original space station, I mean, it took us many, many years to get the International Space Station. They scrapped the plans at that time for having a space station. And maybe the biggest cut and the most consequential one, from what I could tell from the study of this topic, was that they deemed the Saturn V too costly to keep in production. They said, listen, we're just launching these things up and they get thrown away. We've got tons and tons of rocket fuel that just burn up and then we don't get anything back. This space shuttle thing where we get basically the whole thing back, that sounds awesome. That's got to be cheaper, right? Right? And so the space shuttle is the only piece of the original STS that sticks around. And it's easy to see why. You can pitch the space shuttle, and they did and continue to do so for a long time, as this kind of space pickup truck. It was good for everything. You could ride around in it. You could put stuff in the back. You could go to orbit. It was reusable. It seemed perfect to the kinds of people who were wanting to pinch pennies but still not give up the idea of space. And NASA is seeing the purse strings tighten. They see in their future the potential of not going to space at all with people. And they don't want to lose that. They want to keep as much of the space capability that they have as possible. So they go along with these compromises because that's basically their only option.
I mean, it's something, but it's still one of those things where you just see this huge lack of like futuristic thought. It's just all about that bottom line today as opposed to what it could actually do for the species.
There's also the fact that as this is getting pushed through, I found multiple people who leveled accusations of pork barrel spending being shoved into the space shuttle bill. So you had the Space Shuttle, which NASA's like, okay, fine, this is the only thing we can keep, then let us keep that. Like, they beg, essentially, don't cut the Space Shuttle, it's the last piece of the pie. Give us something that we can get to space with. And all the senators are like, yeah, people like space anyway, so this sounds good, we're not going to vote against it, and there's maybe something back in my district, we need a hospital to build, and I know it doesn't have anything to do with the Space Shuttle, but, you guys will foot me a couple million, 100 million, right, for that? Okay, cool. And so the contention is, not only was the Space Shuttle sort of the result of bureaucratic penny pinching, but also it got through as a pork belly rider with a bunch of other stuff on it. So just all the grossest stuff about Washington and politics you can imagine went into making this a reality.
That line item veto thing would be pretty nice for this sort of thing.
Yep. Now, most of you already know how the Space Shuttle works, but for the people back then, it was really revolutionary. I mean, this was unlike any spacecraft design before. The previous spacecraft that you would see would have stages, right? There would be essentially a stack of cylinders, and each cylinder would have some rockets in it, and you would burn the rockets for a while and then drop that cylinder off, and there was a slightly smaller cylinder on top of that. But this new spacecraft, instead of destroying itself, getting into space, it would ride on the back of another airplane into the upper atmosphere, where it would then break away and launch into orbit. It was reusable, so unlike the quote-unquote wasteful Saturn V, it could land like a plane and be ready to launch again in a week or two. It would be safer than the old rockets it replaced, with a projected failure rate of 1 in 100,000 launches. That's
a very, very optimistic failure rate.
We'll get to that. Yep.
It's like, I wouldn't trust my car to do that.
1 in 100,000 leaving of the driveway?
Yeah.
And with so many launches possible for one rocket, it would be cheaper in the long run than the old Saturn V. Now, again, so obviously some of this stuff doesn't end up in the final plan, right? We don't end up launching from the back of a plane, for reasons I'll explain. And it doesn't end up being cheaper, which is maybe like my biggest gripe with the Space Shuttle, is that we just could have kept doing it the old stupid way and saved some money.
Well, there's a reason why they went back to that way with like the Constellation program, and why the Soviets are using theirs, and why SpaceX is building their rockets in that very, very direct tube, like phallus into space way.
Right. We'll talk about the Soviets at the end of this episode a little bit and do some compare and contrast to what the costs were, but just to lay out exactly where the failure in thinking on the Space Shuttle was, these people looked at the best possible estimates for what could be accomplished and assumed that that was definitely what was going to happen and based their budget on that. This is never a good idea. Ever a good idea to assume that the best thing that's possibly could happen is going to happen, because it's not. It's the planning fallacy.
Especially whenever you've got 100,000 like engineers or something like that working for NASA. There's so many different projects happening. Things are going to go bad.
And think about how many parts there are in this thing. It's just an insane thing to think that their perfect projections would end up being anywhere close to correct. So this all sounds great to the lawmakers, right? They're ready to pass the bill, but the military comes in and they say, "Oh, whoa. You guys are building the space thing? Were you going to go to space? Space is where our satellites are. We need to get the satellites up there." And NASA's like, "Well, your satellites are big and heavy. I mean, they're the spy satellites. They're not small things. They're giant, big hunks of metal going around the Earth." And they say, "The space shuttle we've designed, it's not a giant cargo ship. It's relatively small and compact. It was essentially just designed to get people up to this other space station. I guess we're not going to do that anymore, but it's not that big. It's not going to fit a big military satellite in it." And the military comes back and they say, "Well, we need to get our military satellites up there." And NASA's like, "Well, you guys cut the budget for the dang Saturn V that could get a military satellite into orbit. I guess we can make it bigger so it can fit a giant military satellite in the back, even though like 90% of the times we fly up there, it's not going to have that much space filled. And making it bigger is going to make it heavier even when it's empty, which means it's going to be more costly to go into orbit, and it was already going to be more costly because we're essentially inventing all this technology out of nothing. So there are some changes that happened to the design. And now, remember I mentioned earlier it was going to launch from the back of a plane, which we're finally getting back to trying with some of the private space stuff in the present day. But it's not going to work now because they made it so big to fit all this extra stuff the military wants to take into orbit that they have to now come up with a new way of launching it. So now we finally get to the shuttle we all know and love. It would be launched from the ground. It would be strapped to the back of a large external tank with 2 boosters attached to each side. And this configuration left the shuttle in considerably more danger than the old Saturn V rocket stage design. In those older rockets, because the crew was on top of everything that could explode, they were able to build in this escape mechanism for the capsules. So if you get to go to an air museum or a space museum and look at a capsule and see how they're designed, you'll see that they had rockets that were fitted to the front of the capsule, to the nose of the capsule, that in theory, the astronauts could fire and pull themselves away from the rocket if something went wrong. So the rocket starts exploding underneath of you or something bad's happening, you hit the eject button and it pulls you up off the rocket, and now you're at least not right next to the exploding parts. But if you strap your thing to the back of a giant fuel tank, you no longer have that option. There's no escape mechanism that the shuttle can have because it's all kind of wonkily glued together by the belly. Another point of compromise on the design of the shuttle was the boosters. NASA believed that liquid fuel boosters would be more reliable and cheaper to operate in the long run than solid fuel boosters, but the development costs were higher for the liquid fuel boosters than for the solid fuel boosters. And with the budget to design the space shuttle already very tight, they were forced to abandon the idea and use solid fuel boosters instead. Now, for those of you who aren't rocket scientists, solid fuel boosters are essentially like fireworks. I mean, they're really, 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 really big fireworks. But the idea is when you light them, they can't be deactivated, they can't be throttled down. They are burning as hard as they're going to burn for as long as they have fuel. And again, NASA thought that over time, liquid fuel would have been a cheaper way to go, but because they had to keep their initial design within the budget that Washington had given them, they had to cut a corner early on that would end up costing them every single time they launched the shuttle later. NASA had originally projected that the space shuttle could be rehabbed and launched again in a single week, but that turned out to be wildly over-optimistic. The care required to check the many, many shuttle components for potentially fatal defects meant that it took months to prepare them for the launch pad. The fastest turnaround ever was 54 days for the Space Shuttle Challenger, but even this speed proved to be the result of reckless rushing by NASA, which would later result in the Challenger disaster. Speaking of which, the safety of the shuttle program also proved to be wildly overestimated. NASA's initial estimate that one launch in 100,000 would fail proved to be off by more than a factor of 1,000. In the final tally, the space shuttle was the deadliest rocket design ever, killing 14 astronauts, meaning that more than 3% of all the people who flew on the space shuttle were killed by it.
That's a pretty high kill count by any sort of job. That's insane.
And as we mentioned earlier, Russia has been taking people into space pretty much for the same amount of time with arguably less, quality control and care for human life and budget and all of that stuff, and they still didn't manage to have a rocket design this bad.
Yeah, the Soyuz was a pretty efficient rocket. I'm pretty sure it's still in use today. Some of those early ones were a bit more dangerous, but they were only killing one person at a time instead of 7.
Yeah, and you could iterate with those. Once you had the shuttle, you kind of were stuck with the shuttle. The nice thing about throwing your rockets away is the new ones you build can have little changes and stuff. And the cost of human life wasn't the only cost that NASA got wrong. Despite the design compromises made in the space shuttle's design, many of which made it more dangerous to fly, it did not increase the cost of spaceflight. Not only did the shuttle take longer to turn around than NASA initially estimated, but as we already discussed, the larger cargo bay meant that the shuttle was heavier empty, and when you're going into space, every pound is precious. The space shuttle's average cost per pound per launch was $8,000. By comparison, the Russians, who still use a single-use staged rocket design reminiscent of the Saturn V, are able to put astronauts in orbit for far cheaper and more safely than the space shuttle ever could. The estimates here are a little bit tricky because, again, the Russians might use a different rocket for different things, whereas the space shuttle would be used for all of our getting to space options, but some of these price differences are insane. The average cost per launch of the space shuttle was $450 million and would rise as high as $1.5 billion in 2011. In contrast, the rocket that the Russians use to get to space today, the Proton M, costs $65 million per launch. And obviously, private investment in space travel is driving some of these costs even lower. The Falcon 9 can put satellites into orbit for a cost of around $1,000 per pound. So, here's the thing. The space shuttle wasn't a bad idea in the beginning. When it was initially proposed as one piece of a larger network, it could have been something really, really interesting. But the budgets got cut, the military demanded compromises, and as the shuttle design morphed and changed, NASA was forced to do more and more with less and less. My father once told me the more things a tool does, the less good it is at any of them. The space shuttle tried to be the Swiss Army knife of space travel, but a box full of tools is better than one that tries to do everything. And that, ultimately, I think, is why the space shuttle was not the success that we would like to think it was.
I can definitely see that. Like, whenever I think of the space shuttle, I just think of it mostly launching satellites and being able to get up there and do some pretty cool experiments, get to the space station and so on. And in the title, I mean, space shuttle, it was supposed to just be a way of getting them up there. I didn't really think of it like that before. I just thought of it as like, oh, we have this cool thing that we're gonna, like, be able to do all these different missions from. But whenever it turned away from just a transport vessel to do other things in space, then it really became that all-in-one tool that you were talking about. And I can see why there's so much disappointment over what the possibilities were there, not to mention the dangers.
Yeah, I think we talked a little early about the planning fallacy, where they assumed that everything would go well. I think we also maybe got caught in a sunk cost fallacy as well. As the space shuttle went on, we just sort of kept doing it because that's what we had. And it's worth noting, and I'm not like pro-Russia here. We said some very positive-ish things about Russia in this episode. I'm going to say another one. But the Russians did build a space shuttle. They built, and this was something I wasn't aware of at all, but they built something called the Buran. And if you look at it, spelled B-U-R-A-N, it looks exactly like the space shuttle, except they maybe got liquid boosters for theirs. They never flew it on a manned flight. They did one flight in space, unmanned, automatic, and brought it back, and they stuck it in a museum and never used it again. So
that's a pretty expensive museum piece.
Yeah, but on the other hand, using it over and over again may be more expensive, you know?
Yeah.
So
I would honestly say one of the biggest problems with NASA and the way that we have things set up is that they have to renegotiate their budget every single year instead of having these programs set aside for multiple years in advance and not being able to have them change. Because we almost, during the shuttle era, went back to the Constellation program, which would be a lot more like the Soyuz rocket and would have been very efficient. But early in the Obama administration, that was canceled so that they could focus a little bit more on climate science.
I do think there is something to what you said there. The idea of having to play politics constantly, of needing to have people vote you more of a budget. On the one hand, it's good, right? Like, I'm thankful that NASA doesn't run the world and just take whatever money they want to do whatever they want with, because, I mean, we would have some cool spaceships, but I don't know that everything would be better. But on the other hand, if you're NASA, it's like, come on, okay, you have climate. We're very concerned about the climate. And then I don't know what they would say to Trump. Oh, the Space Force. Yeah, we're going to be a big part of the Space Force. Just whatever you have to do to get them to give you enough money to keep like putting something out there.
Yeah, that's kind of why I don't mind the Space Force, because it's like, hey, more rocket stuff. Let's keep building cool stuff for space.
Anyway, that is going to do it for this week. I hope that I didn't make too many people very, very angry. If you did,
tweet us that you unsubscribed at Human Echoes.
If by some miracle you happen to enjoy this episode, you can click on the like button if you're over on YouTube. If you liked us even more than that, you can go over to our patreon.com page, patreon.com/Human Echoes, and help support the show. Keep the ball a-rolling. The $2 level is known as the bad idea, Tony, as a shout out to all of our wonderful listeners here. Go check that out, patreon.com/Human Echoes, and we will see you guys next week with another episode of Bad Ideas.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.